Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something uh, that's super relevant to all of us, and that's the Fed's dual mandate. In particular, we've got some really interesting source material for this one.
Yeah, this is going to be a good one.
It is, yeah. So we've got notes and a full transcript from a recent Fed event where top economists were debating the history of the dual mandate. And, they really dug into how the Fed's approach has evolved over time, what's worked, what hasn't, what might be on the horizon. This particular event took place on November 14th, 2024. So it's pretty up to date. By the time we're done with this deep dive, you'll have a much deeper understanding of how the Fed's decisions directly affect your wallet and your job prospects.
Yeah, it really is a complex topic, but crucial to understand, especially in today's economy.
For sure. So let's start by going back in time a bit. The Fed wasn't always so upfront about how it managed this dual mandate. In fact, before the mid-1990s, they were notoriously tight-lipped about the whole thing.
Yeah, it's true. Very guarded in their communication, especially when it came to explaining how they balanced these two sometimes competing goals.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because neither inflation nor unemployment was even mentioned in the original Federal Reserve Act of 1913.
Yeah.
You'd think those would be front and center, given what the Fed is supposed to do.
Yeah, well, I think it's a reminder that, the Fed's role has evolved significantly over time. Back then, the focus was more on preventing financial panics, ensuring the stability of the banking system, and the idea of using monetary policy to manage the broader economy came later.
So when did this dual mandate officially become part of the Fed's mission?
So it was formally codified in the Federal Reserve Reform Act of 1977. And this act directed the Fed to promote maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates.
Okay, so that's where it all began. But even then, it sounds like the maximum employment part of the equation took a back seat for a while.
Right. So for much of the late 1970s and 1980s, under Volcker and Greenspan, the primary focus was on combating inflation, which was a major problem at the time. And they rarely even acknowledged the dual mandate publicly.
Really? So they were just like inflation, inflation, inflation.
Pretty much, yeah.
That was it. So how did this shift towards a more balanced approach come about? When did the Fed start taking both sides of the mandate seriously?
Well, there's this fascinating moment in 1994 that really marks a turning point. Alan Blinder, who was then vice chair of the Fed, he gave a speech at the Jackson Hole conference that caused quite a stir.
Yeah, I've read about this. Pretty bold move for the time,
Yes,
wasn't
it
it?
was. He had the audacity to point out very publicly that the Fed actually had a dual mandate and that Congress had specifically charged them with pursuing both maximum employment and stable prices.
Yeah.
Seems obvious now, but back then, emphasizing both goals equally, it was a pretty radical idea.
Why was that so controversial? It's literally what the law said.
Well, at the time, the unemployment rate was around 6%. And Blinder hinted without explicitly saying so that maybe it could be pushed even lower. And this idea that the Fed might prioritize employment to the point of risking higher inflation sparked a huge backlash.
So just acknowledging the full scope of the dual mandate was seen as a potential threat to price stability.
Right.
That's wild. What kind of pushback did Blinder face?
Well, one columnist went as far as to say that Blinder lacked the moral and intellectual qualities to lead the Fed. Gives you a sense of how strongly people felt about prioritizing inflation control above all else.
Wow. It's amazing to think that simply stating the Fed's legal mandate was seen as radical. It really highlights how much the economic conversation has changed since then. So Blinder opened the door to a more balanced approach. But how did the Fed actually start putting that into practice? I mean, stable prices and maximum employment sound pretty vague. How do you actually measure those things?
That's a great question, and it's one that the Fed grappled with for a long time. The 1977 Act didn't specify exact numbers for these goals, so there was a lot of room for interpretation, which led to some ambiguity in the Fed's actions.
So how did they move from these broad concepts to something more concrete? Did they eventually put some numbers to these goals?
Yes, they did. Ben Bernanke, who became Fed chair in 2006, was a strong advocate for setting a specific target for inflation. It took a while, but eventually the FOMC settled on a 2% inflation target. And this provided a clear benchmark for what they considered price stability.
2% inflation doesn't sound too bad, but what about maximum employment? That seems a lot harder to define, let alone measure. The Fed can't just create jobs out of thin air, can they?
You're right. Defining maximum employment is much trickier. The Fed can't directly control the unemployment rate, so instead they linked it to the concept of the natural rate of unemployment, which is essentially the lowest unemployment rate you can have without causing inflation to rise.
So the natural rate is kind of like a sweet spot for the labor market, where everyone who wants a job can find one without pushing wages and prices up too quickly.
Exactly. Finding the equilibrium point where the labor market is operating at its full potential.
But if the Fed can't directly control the unemployment rate, how do they even try to influence it?
Well, that's where monetary policy comes in. By adjusting interest rates, the Fed can try to nudge the economy towards that natural rate of unemployment. It's not a precise science, but it's one of the main levers they have to influence the job market.
So it's more like steering a giant ship than flipping a switch. Takes time and careful adjustments to get the economy where you want it to go.
That's a great analogy. And it's important to note that Bernanke, unlike his predecessors, was a big believer in transparency. He frequently talked about the dual mandate publicly and tried to explain the Fed's actions in a way that the public could understand.
That's a huge shift from the days of cryptic pronouncements. So by the early 2010s, we've got a 2% inflation target and a general understanding of maximum employment linked to this natural rate of unemployment. Sounds like things were starting to get clearer, but I'm guessing it wasn't all smooth sailing from there.
You're right. Even with these clearer objectives, the Fed faced a new challenge. Inflation consistently fell short of that 2% target for years.
Really? So even with a target in place, hitting it wasn't guaranteed?
Not at all. And this persistent undershooting of the inflation target raised some tough questions for the Fed. Were they aiming too low? Had the relationship between inflation and unemployment changed fundamentally? These were the kinds of debates happening within the Fed at the time.
So what did they do? Did they just throw up their hands and give up on the 2% target?
No, they doubled down. In 2012, the FOMC issued a landmark statement explicitly reaffirming their commitment to that 2% inflation goal.
I see. So they were trying to make it clear to everyone that they were serious about hitting that target, even if they hadn't been very successful so far.
Exactly. As much about managing expectations as it was about changing policy, they wanted to signal to the markets that they were committed to price stability.
Okay, so they made a public commitment to the 2% target,
hmm
but we know that inflation kept undershooting. What else was happening during this period that might have influenced the Fed's thinking?
Well, while inflation was stubbornly low, the unemployment rate was steadily declining. And this led to some interesting discussions about whether the natural rate itself might be shifting lower.
So maybe the economy could handle lower unemployment without triggering inflation. That'll be good news.
There was certainly a growing sense that the relationship between inflation and unemployment might not be as straightforward as previously thought. And this was further complicated by the fact that the unemployment rate on its own wasn't telling the whole story about the health of the labor market.
Right. Because there are other factors to consider like wage growth, the types of jobs being created, and how many people are actually participating in the workforce.
Exactly. And this realization that they needed to look beyond the unemployment rate to get a full picture of the labor market ultimately led to a major update of the Fed's policy framework in 2020.
A major update. That sounds like a great place to pause for now. We'll pick up the story in part 2 and delve into what this 2020 framework update entailed and what consequences it had. We're back and ready to unpack this major update to the Fed's framework in 2020. Last we left off, the Fed was grappling with this persistently low inflation, even with a clear 2% target in place. And they were also starting to realize that the unemployment rate alone wasn't a perfect measure of labor market health. So what did this big update actually change?
Well, first of all, it was really a reflection of the evolving economic landscape. The Fed was realizing that the economy was operating differently than it had in the past, and they needed to adapt their approach.
Can you give us an example of what you mean by operating differently?
Yeah, so one key challenge was something called the neutral rate of interest. It's a bit of a technical concept, but basically it's the interest rate that neither stimulates nor restricts economic growth. And for a variety of reasons, this neutral rate had been trending downwards for years.
So the Fed had less room to maneuver, so to speak, less ability to lower interest rates to boost the economy if they were already close to this neutral rate.
Exactly. And this realization led to a greater willingness to use unconventional tools like quantitative easing, even when interest rates were already very low.
Now, you mentioned quantitative easing, or QE. Can you explain in plain English what that actually is? I've heard the term thrown around a lot, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Sure. In simple terms, QE is a way for the Fed to inject money directly into the economy by purchasing assets like government bonds. And this is meant to lower long-term interest rates and encourage lending and investment.
Okay, so it's like a way to give the economy a boost when traditional interest rate cuts aren't enough?
You can think of it that way. And this 2020 update signaled that the Fed was willing to use QE more actively going forward, not just as a last resort, but that wasn't the only significant change. The update also subtly shifted the emphasis of the dual mandate.
Oh, how so?
Well, remember how the 1977 Act listed the goals as maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates?
Yes, I remember.
This update changed the order to match the original Federal Reserve Act of 1913, placing maximum employment first, followed by price stability.
Interesting. It seems like a small change, but I can see how it might signal a greater focus on the employment side of the equation. Was that the intention?
That's certainly how many people interpreted it. The Fed insisted that both goals were still equally important. But this reordering, combined with the greater emphasis on unconventional tools like QE, suggested a shift in priorities.
Okay, so maximum employment is now top of mind. But what about the 2% inflation target? Did they stick with that?
Yes, the 2% target remained, but it was given a bit of a makeover. The update introduced the concept of flexible average inflation targeting, or FAI.
Okay, another acronym. Break that one down for us. What does F8 actually mean?
Essentially, it meant that the Fed would be willing to let inflation run a little hot for a while if it had been running too cold for an extended period. They would aim to achieve inflation that averaged 2% over time, rather than sticking rigidly to that number at all times.
So if inflation had been stubbornly below 2% for a few years, they might be okay with it going above 2% for a bit to balance things out.
That's the basic idea. It was an attempt to make the 2% target more of a long-term goal, recognizing that there would be periods of overshooting and undershooting.
This all sounds fairly reasonable. So what happened? Did this new framework work as intended?
Well, there's a bit of irony here. Just as the Fed implemented this new framework with its greater emphasis on employment and flexibility on inflation, inflation unexpectedly shot up.
Oh no. Talk about bad timing.
It certainly was. Inflation surged in late 2021 and early 2022, peaking at over 7% in June 2022, the highest it had been in decades. This caught many economists off guard both inside and outside the Fed.
Wow. So they rolled out this new framework designed to handle low inflation, and then boom, inflation explodes. What happened?
Well, there's no single explanation, but it was likely a combination of factors. Supply chain disruptions caused by the pandemic, pent-up consumer demand after lockdowns, and government stimulus measures all play a role.
So it was a kind of perfect storm of inflationary pressures.
Yeah.
What did the Fed do in response?
Well, they acted aggressively, raising interest rates rapidly in an attempt to cool down the economy and bring inflation back under control.
That makes sense. But wasn't that risky? Sudden sharp interest rate hikes can trigger a recession, can't they?
It was definitely a gamble. Many economists feared that the Fed's actions would lead to a significant increase in unemployment as the economy slowed down.
So what happened? Were they able to tame inflation without causing a major economic downturn?
Amazingly, it seems they were. Inflation has come down considerably since that peak in June 2022. And while the economy has slowed, the labor market has remained surprisingly strong.
So successful disinflation so far, at least. But was this due to the Fed's strategy or just dumb luck?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one that economists are still debating fiercely. Some argue that the 2020 framework itself was partly to blame for the inflation surge.
How so?
They claim that the flexible average inflation targeting, or FAFITE, prevented the Fed from responding aggressively enough to rising inflation early on. They argue that the Fed was too focused on making up for past periods of low inflation, and that this allowed inflation to get out of control.
So the very framework intended to handle low inflation may have actually backfired when inflation spiked.
That's the argument. Others, however, contend that the timing of the Fed's actions wasn't significantly affected by the framework, and that the inflation surge was largely unavoidable given the unprecedented circumstances of the pandemic and its aftermath.
Okay, so different interpretations of the same events. Where do things stand now with all this hindsight?
Well, the Fed is currently undergoing another review of its policy framework, taking stock of the lessons learned from this recent experience.
So they're reassessing their approach in light of this wild ride we've just been through. What are some of the key questions they're grappling with?
There are many. Some economists are pushing for a return to a more rigid inflation target, abandoning the flexibility of fate.
So back to 2% no matter what.
Yes,
Yeah.
essentially. They argue that the flexibility of fate created too much uncertainty and allowed inflation to get out of hand. Others, however, believe that fate is still a valuable tool, but that it needs to be refined and perhaps communicated more clearly.
So tweak it, don't trash it.
Exactly. There's also a debate about whether the Fed should pay more attention to asset bubbles like the ones we saw in the housing market and the tech sector.
Because those bubbles can create financial instability that can spill over into the real economy, right?
Precisely. There's growing recognition that the Fed can't just focus on inflation and employment in isolation. They need to take a broader view of financial stability as well.
So a more holistic approach.
You could say that. The Fed is also thinking about how to better communicate its intentions to the public.
Because if people don't understand what the Fed is doing and why it can backfire, right?
Exactly. Clear and consistent communication is crucial for maintaining credibility and managing expectations.
So lots of big questions on the table as the Fed reevaluates its approach. As we head into the final part of our deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners so far?
The Fed's dual mandate is a complex and constantly evolving challenge. What's clear is that there are no easy answers, and the Fed is always learning and adapting as it strives to fulfill its mission.
And it's important for all of us to understand what the Fed is doing and why, because their decisions impact everyone. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll explore some of the potential paths forward for the Fed's dual mandate and what it might mean for the economy and for you in the years to come. All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Fed's dual mandate. And we've covered a lot of ground, from the early days of cryptic communication to the 2020 framework update and that recent inflation surge. It's clear that the Fed's job is anything but easy. As we look ahead, what are some of the potential paths forward for the Fed? And what might those mean for the economy and for us?
Well, as we discussed, the Fed is currently in the midst of another review of its policy framework, right? They're trying to figure out, what worked, what didn't. How can they best adapt to the challenges of a rapidly changing economic landscape?
So what are some of the big questions that they're wrestling with? What are the key points of debate among economists right now?
Well, one of the most contentious issues is the future of flexible average inflation targeting, or a FAI. As we talked about earlier, some economists argue that it contributed to the recent inflation surge by preventing the Fed from acting quickly enough. And they're pushing for a return to a more rigid 2% inflation target.
So ditch the flexibility and just focus on keeping inflation at or below 2% at all times.
Yeah.
What are the arguments against that approach?
While others argue that abandoning fate would be a mistake, they point out that the economy is constantly evolving, and that a rigid inflation target could limit the Fed's ability to respond to unexpected shocks. They believe that fate is still a valuable tool, but that it needs to be refined and perhaps communicated more effectively.
Some more nuance, less dogma.
Exactly. There's a growing recognition that the Fed needs to be nimble and adaptable, not bound by rigid rules that might not make sense in all situations.
Makes sense. We've also talked about the need for the Fed to take a broader view of financial stability, not just focus on inflation and employment in isolation.
Yeah.
What might that look like in practice?
Well, there's increasing discussion about the role of asset purchases in monetary policy. As you know, the Fed engaged in large-scale asset purchases known as quantitative easing during the financial crisis and the pandemic.
Right, to inject liquidity into the system and lower long-term interest rates.
Exactly. And now some economists are arguing that these asset purchases should become a permanent part of the Fed's toolkit, not just something used in emergencies.
So a more proactive approach to managing financial conditions, even when there isn't a crisis looming.
Yeah, you could say that. The idea is that the Fed could use asset purchases to preemptively address potential bubbles or imbalances in the financial system before they become a major problem.
That sounds pretty powerful, but also potentially risky.
Yeah,
How do you decide when and how to intervene without creating unintended consequences?
that's the challenge. And there's no easy answer. It requires careful judgment, a deep understanding of financial markets, and clear communication with the public about what the Fed is doing and why.
Speaking of communication, we've touched on how important that is for the Fed. What are some ways that they could improve in that area?
Well, there's a growing sense that the Fed needs to do a better job of explaining its decisions in plain language, avoiding jargon and technical terms that might confuse the public.
So less Fed, speak more plain English.
Exactly. They also need to be more transparent about their deliberations and the different viewpoints within the FOMC.
So give people a glimpse behind the curtain, so to speak. Show that they're grappling with these issues in a thoughtful and balanced way.
Precisely. Greater transparency can help build trust and understanding, which is essential for the Fed to be effective.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway for our listeners? What should they be watching for as the Fed charts its course in the years ahead?
I think the key message is that the Fed is constantly evolving. Their approach to the dual mandate is not set in stone, and it's likely to continue to adapt as the economy changes and new challenges emerge.
So stay informed, pay attention to the debates, and understand that the decisions the Fed makes have real-world consequences for all of us.
Yeah, it's also crucial to remember that the Fed doesn't operate in a vacuum. Their decisions are influenced by a whole range of factors, including political pressures, global economic conditions, technological advancements.
So it's a complex ecosystem with a lot of moving parts.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the Fed's dual mandate and the challenges they face in trying to fulfill it is so important.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about. Thanks for guiding us through this complex but fascinating topic.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Fed's dual mandate. We hope you've gained a deeper understanding of this crucial aspect of our economy.
And remember, the economy affects all of us, and the Fed's actions have a ripple effect throughout our lives.
So stay curious, stay informed, and who knows, maybe one day you'll be the one at the Fed making these tough decisions.
Hmm.